go, Albert. Woohoo! The new BMW M2. Excited to drive this car. I am a big believer that when it comes to M cars, smaller is better. And you know, a lot of people have been excited about this M2 because, you know, M cars have just been bigger and bigger and fatter every year, and this is sort of reversing that trend in a way. But to save you guys some time, let me cut to the chase. It is awesome and you should get one. Thanks for watching. But if you want to know my opinions as an M4 owner of this M2, stick around. You know, the biggest difference between the M4 and the M2 is not the performance or the way it drives, because they're actually very similar. It comes down to, before you even purchase this car, the package options and configuring this car. I think the M2 is unique amongst BMWs over the last, I don't know, 2, maybe 3 decades, in that it has so few options. You know, BMWs, doesn't matter what model you get, there's always a million options, and that's where BMW makes the money, is nickel and diming you on all those millions of little things that you think you must have. Whereas the M2 is unique, and I was blown away that they just, you can buy it, you can click it, and then there's 4 colors, 1 package, and like 3 options, and 2 of the options are ridiculous. And so they start out at what, low 50s, and maxed out with everything, it's still in the 50s. Whereas an M4 starts out in mid 60s, tick all the boxes, and you're over $100,000. And that's really the big difference, is that this car, it is as you buy it. You know, you can't configure a lot of things on it. And for some people that might be disappointing, but a lot of that crap you just don't need. This car is fantastic as it is. So let's start with the power. Supposedly this car is what, 60 horsepower less than the M4, and you do notice that it's a little less powerful, but still a massive amount of power. And what's interesting about the power is that while it's still a new model and there haven't been a lot of people that have dynoed them yet, the dyno results that are out already show that, as per usual, BMW are understating the power of these engines. The dyno result that I've seen, on the first dyno result I saw, was showing 380 horsepower at the wheels. This car's supposed to have 365 horsepower at the engine, at the crank. So clearly these new M2s are putting out more than 400 horsepower. Why BMW does this, I do not know. And just as a reminder, the M4, which is supposed to have 425, we have all concluded actually has 485 horsepower, because they do about 430, 440 at the wheel. So once again, the good news, if you're buying an M2, it's a lot more powerful than they claim. And the engine is very similar in its power delivery to the M4. There's plenty of low down torque, as you'd expect from a turbocharged engine, and you know, it's not lacking in power, is what I'd say, and a very similar power delivery to the M4. So what about performance? Well, you guys have probably read, as I have, and looked at professional drivers comparing the M4 and the M2, and the conclusion is that they're almost identical in performance. Certainly identical in 0 to 60 times, and on short courses, short race courses, the people road and track and so forth have compared them and found them to be almost identical. In fact, the M2 often has the slight advantage over the M4, and this is a little bit of a surprise, because there is still probably a 60 horsepower difference between these two cars, and the weight difference isn't that much, you know, between 50 to 150 pounds depending on how you configure them. But yeah, they're very similar in performance, and certainly driving this M2, you know, I feel quite at home, and I feel like I'm driving a manual edition of my M4, that's for sure. Certainly the way it delivers the power is very similar, and you know, the handling is very similar. Just feels like a slightly smaller car, which is odd, because as I talk about when I walk around the outside, it's actually no thinner than the M4. It's only about half an inch wider, the M4, than the M2. But in the cabin, you do feel it's a little smaller, which is great. you know, smaller is always better, as I said. Okay, so here we are in the sweltering heat to take a look at the outside of the M cars, the M4 and the baby brother M2. More similar than different. From the front end, I would give the M2 the edge. I love the nose of the M2. It's just so much more graceful. The problem I've had with the M4 is that the nose just sort of tapers off too quickly there, I think. Well, my opinion at least. And I love the extra aggressive flares down here, these little grills. You see how they just stick out a little bit more than on the M4. Very nice. So yeah, front end's very similar, but personally I'd give it to the M2. The M2 is a handsome and aggressive looking car from the front. Around the rear end, I'd give it actually to the M4. I've never been a big fan of the rear end of the 2 Series. Whereas the 4, I don't know, they just seem to get the proportions right. Especially from the quarter view here. That's not to say there's anything wrong with the M2. It's still a handsome car from the rear end, and of course it's been given the M treatment, quad tailpipes and so forth, M badges, little flares here on the rear wheels. In fact, the flares are so much more noticeable than the flares on the M4. So yeah, the flares on the M2 are great. What's interesting is that despite the fact that the M2 looks so much smaller than the M4, especially in person, width-wise, they're almost identical. In fact, there's only half an inch in it, or about 1.5 centimeters, maybe 2 centimeters in it. So width-wise, they're both much the same. It's the length where the real difference is. 8-inch difference between the M2 and the M4, obviously the M2 being so much shorter. And 8 inches is about 20 centimeters, which is quite a lot, and you can certainly see that on the inside and in the trunk space. And I guess that's where the weight savings comes in, from that 8 inches. And that's noticeable here in real life as well. And it certainly looks a lot shorter. But yeah, they look great together. I love these M cars sitting side by side. It'd be cool to have an M6 here as well. So let's have a look at the interior, and we'll start with the trunkus. Not much to see in here. It's a fairly roomy trunk. It's just a little shorter than the regular 4 Series, obviously, because it's a 2 Series, but still wide enough for most things, so no complaints on the trunk. Onto the interior, and the thing that strikes you as soon as you get in the interior is the fantastic stitching. Particularly on this car with the blue exterior, you get the blue stitching. I love a bit of stitching, as you know, and they've done it everywhere in this car, and it looks fantastic, right down to the mats. The mats have got stitching them around them as well. But yeah, on the seats, on this armrest, on the brake, on the gear lever, everywhere there's stitching. They've made it blue to match the outside, and it looks sharp. Looks better than the M4 inside from that point of view. But things go downhill a little bit from there. I guess the cost saving comes in, and it's a little disappointing that they've used the standard BMW Dakota leather that I have complained about in the past and still don't like. It feels like kind of vinyl leather to me. I've never liked the Dakota leather. It's just out of place in a car of this price point. But stitching looks good. Too bad about the leather. Round at the dash here, you've got the standard BMW M steering wheel, which does have the nice leather. So the thing you're touching the most feels right, and of course the steering wheel is always nice. And the instrument cluster is the smaller version. Something to note about the instrument cluster that I've read about, and even the owner of this car had mentioned, was that oddly they've made the dials a grey on grey. And I noticed it myself when I was driving it. It can be very difficult to read the dials in this car because there's not enough contrast on the lettering. You know, in certain lights, especially with harsh sunlight coming in, you can't actually see what speed you're doing from the gauge. So that's annoying. But otherwise, it's functional, and standard BMW screen and clusters here. A noticeable reduction in buttons down here, because obviously this car has far fewer options and you can't even add them. You know, when you sit in the M4, there's a lot of buttons down here and there's more buttons over there, and buttons, but this car, just fewer options. And of course, even up here, you can get the sunroof in the M4, M3, which you can't get in this car. And of course, you can extend the leather up here, which you can't do in the M2 as well. So it's just rubber up here. But it's got a nice little sort of carbon thingy around the edge here that looks nice. You know, there's nothing wrong with the interior. Yeah, it's just disappointing that they didn't put M leather in. It's an M car, put the M leather in. Ah, BMW. Yeah, and as I said earlier, there are no options. There are no options for this car. In fact, one of the more expensive options, aside from the automatic transmission, the only other expensive option is a silly option called the M Drivers Package for $2,500. What drunken fool in the marketing department at BMW thought that was a good idea? All it does is slightly increase the top speed of the car from 155 to 168, I think, and gives you a one-day driving course, which BMW often give BMW drivers of M cars anyway for free. So it's just a rip-off. $2,500 to increase the top speed of your car, which they should have done in the first place. Rant over. Anyway, let's go and jump in the back seat and see how the shorter car fares for reduced leg room in the rear. Albert, what you doing back here? You got a padlock. Move your ass. Come on. Over you go. Alrighty. Oh, I found a quarter. Well, I would say the headroom is maybe a little less than in the M4. My head also hits the roof in the M4, but perhaps not as hard as this. And the legroom isn't too bad. I'd say a 5'8" person would be perfectly comfortable in the back here. So yeah, there isn't a big difference in room in the back. Yeah, certainly someone who's 6 foot tall like me gonna hit their head, but someone a little taller, a little shorter, would be fine back here. Like our Albert over here. You're pretty comfortable, buddy, aren't you? Yeah. So finally, my thoughts on the M2. Well, compared to the M4, you know, there's not a lot of difference between the two of them. Performance-wise, they're much the same, and really the M2 is a bargain. Really, all you're getting with the M4, is a bunch of toys. And some of the toys, you know, I'd miss. What I like about the M4 is you get the head-up display and a bunch of other neat toys. But if you can live without those toys, the M2 is the car to get. It's so much cheaper, and it's such a fantastic drive. But I think what a lot of people will probably be wanting me to compare to is other cars in this price range, sort of low 50s, low to mid 50s. And its main competitor, of course, is the Mercedes-Benz CLA 45 AMG. Which actually starts out a little low at 50,000, but once you configure the Mercedes-Benz to the same spec as this, it's a lot higher, a lot more expensive. You get into the 60s or mid 60s quite quickly with the add-ons for the Mercedes. And really the Mercedes doesn't compare. You know, it's a 4-cylinder engine, and the CLAs just don't have the build quality of the BMWs, and you notice that inside. It's very plasticky, it's very squeaky inside the CLAs, and the driving experience is completely different as well. You know, I'd take the M2 every day over a CLA. The real competitor, I think, is the Porsche Cayman. They're both, once again, the same price to start with, but once again, nobody buys a Porsche Cayman that is completely bare. You know, whereas this, you could happily buy completely bare. The Porsche Cayman, once you configure it up, you're in the 60s or 70s, no problem at all. But like for like, you know, the Cayman is a more balanced car, and could be argued that it's a more fun car to drive because of that. But really, the M2's got so much more power and it's so much easier to live with. I think personally, I would still take the M2 over the Cayman most of the time. So that's my review of the BMW M2. What a fantastic car. I've really enjoyed driving this car today.